Good evening and welcome to our first Monday's webinar, the first one for this year. We've been away from our first Monday's webinar for a while. These webinars started right at the beginning of the pandemic as we just tried to find a way to talk about just some of the practical implications of navigating the pandemic. And I think along the way, the webinars over the last 2 years took more of the shape of just exploring practical implications of living faithfully as a Christian in our current cultural context. And so we've talked about many topics since we first started these webinars. But tonight we're back to the place where we started, and that is talking specifically about the pandemic. And I know for me, when I kind of even say those words, pandemic, it's kind of brings back a little bit of like PTSD, because I think for the last month, at least beginning of this year, it's been so great to feel like, things are a lot more familiar, in terms of the pandemic. And so it's kind of hard to go back to talking about these things, but so much has changed, especially over the last year. And so there's just a lot that we really need to chat about and just get some perspectives on the pandemic. Where are we exactly? Where are we headed? And how can we prepare ourselves this year? So we have Dr. Garth Japhet with us again tonight. So he was with us almost exactly a year ago, pretty much about at the time when the government first started rolling out its vaccines. And so we brought in Dr. Garth Japhet. He was a great guy to bring on board. He's a medical doctor, has been involved in the vaccine rollout in the country. I think he was in an advisory capacity to the government in terms of its education and communications around vaccinations. At the time, we had a great conversation with Garth back then. And so Garth is back tonight to give us perspective a year later on the pandemic and where we are and where we're heading. So I'll reintroduce him a little bit. I know there's probably some people out there who weren't on that webinar the last time. Most of the people listening probably from our church, Rosebank, will know him. He was a member at the church for about 19 years, founded Rose Act, which is still kind of the core ministry around which Rays of Hope is built. He also, I think I want to mention this part again to you, he's the founding CEO of Heartlines organization, which is doing amazing work in South Africa, helping South Africans deal with issues that we're facing in this country through story education. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with a lot of what Heartlines has done Beyond the River. I think it was one of the more recent ones, but exciting news. They've been working on a project called Fathers Matter, and just kind of heard news in the last couple of weeks that their short films are going to air on SABC, likely September or April, but they're in negotiations and about to go into production for those. So Heartlines just doing amazing work using story education to help South Africans through what specific issues we're going through. So shout out to Heartlines and all the work that they're doing there. And much more that I could say about Garth, but we said a lot about him last time, but I really want to allow time for him to speak tonight. Maybe just to mention as well, does have a book out called Like Water Is for Fish. That's at the Rosebank bookstore or online. So go ahead and grab that. Maybe just a bit about his credentials. So is a doctor and has been on the Department of Health Advisory Committee, written a lot of material on the pandemic, done a lot of talks on it. He's married to Jane, who's also a medical doctor working in the field of HIV medicine, two children, Rebecca studying, I think about third year this year, and Lee in grade 12. And so without further ado, welcome Dr. Garth Japhet.
Thank you so much, Richard, and it's good to be back with you at a very different point of the epidemic to which we were a year ago. I can't believe it is that long, but thank God, we really are in such a different place. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you for coming back, Garth. How does it feel to be the first person to be invited back to our webinar? You're the one with that distinction, so well done.
It's going to the top of my CV. Yeah, it's going to the top of my CV. As they say, don't clap, send money. Yeah, we're an NGO, so don't clap, send money. That's how we roll. But no, Richard, it's a joy to be with you, and hopefully just give you some reflections on where we've come from, and also, some ideas based on the consultations, readings, etc., as to where we may be going on a whole range of different areas, from the projection of what this virus might do to what life might look like, and to what sort of treatments might be coming. And then we'll open up for questions once I'm finished. But I'm going to share some slides this evening and just use that as the background for my talk. So shall I go ahead?
Yeah, just a note for listeners. So as Garth mentioned, we will have a time for Q&A. So get your questions in. You can do that in the comment section. So if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, just write out your questions there. We'll gather those questions. And once Garth is finished with his presentation, I'll come back on the screen and we'll have some time for Q&A. But that's all from my side. So all over to you, Garth.
Thanks, Richard. I'm going to just share my screen and see if we can get that tech working nicely. So I hope that you can see that, Richard. I hope everybody can see that. So this evening I'm just going to be talking a little bit about where we are right now in this epidemic and where we've come from. And as I said, I will deal right at the beginning with a little bit of a summary as a country and as a world with where we've got to. So what's the COVID update? In South Africa, as of yesterday, we had done over 22 million tests. We've had over 3.6 million people test positive, 3.48 have recovered. Deaths officially 95,000, but unofficially and probably more accurately around 300,000. We think that there is probably an undercounting of at least 3 to that figure. And as you'll see, and may or may not know, but these statistics, certainly for the epidemic as we stand right now, thankfully we are on the back end of this fourth wave with 1,752 new cases yesterday on Sunday with 18 deaths. Also of interest maybe is over 30 million vaccines have been administered to date. So a big change from where we were. Just to look at vaccines to date, currently at least one dose, 33% of our population at around 19 million, fully vaccinated, 16.7 million or 28%. Boosters given, 646, and we're going to look at the booster and what that involves with a little bit later. A fairly stunning statistic is that 53% of the global population is now fully vaccinated. And that is equivalent to 10 billion doses of vaccine. And that's a really important figure to remember, because when we think about adverse side effects, etc., we've got to just place into perspective just how many people have been vaccinated to date. So there's also, we think that at least 70% of our population has either been vaccinated or has had COVID. A lot of it will have been subclinical, i.e. no real symptoms, but we think that we're up to around 70% of the population of having either been vaccinated or having COVID at least once. I just want to bring your attention to what I think is a incredibly important slide. And that is a lot of people are asking, well, does it work? And probably the starkest sort of example of how well it works is, I think we all know by now that it doesn't stop you necessarily getting COVID. It prevents COVID in a lot of cases, but it certainly doesn't prevent it. But what it does do is it prevents severe hospitalization, severe illness, and potential death. And there, if you look at this graph, which is from US hospitals in November and December, you've got a huge difference between people who've not been vaccinated versus those that have been fully vaccinated, and a difference even in recent times with people who have been boosted and vaccinated. I'd like to tell you a very quick story, because I think there is a lot of debate around, personal choice versus the good of the community. And if I'm not at risk, why should I get vaccinated? The reality is, although you may not have risk profiles, everybody actually has some risk of getting severely ill from COVID and ending up in hospital in an ICU. A friend of mine is a head and neck surgeon at Tygerberg Hospital, the big academic hospital in Cape Town. And a lot of his surgery is with cancer patients. And he told me the other day that he has had to cancel over 100 surgeries, which has consigned those 100 people to almost certain death, because he needs an ICU bed for often 1 to 3 days. And these ICU beds are currently being taken up, or have been certainly previously, by people who have not been vaccinated. And they often are in ICU beds for weeks at a time. So one of the clearest reasons for vaccination is about just allowing, making sure we don't end up in ICU. Because when we do, we basically block beds that could be used by people who really need them only for a few days. So certainly a very stark reminder of the fact that we get vaccinated, not just ourselves, but the ripple effect of, in the unlikely event that we should end up in ICU, and as you can see, the unvaxxed versus vaxxed, I, by my choice, have essentially potentially led to somebody not being able to access that ICU bed even for a few days. So that is where we are right now. But I think the big thing here really for all of us is we're tired, we're over this COVID, and where are we going from here? What's next? I think there is as Richard was saying, a sort of general breathing out, we're back to normal. And to a degree, we are back to normal to a certain extent. But there is, although there is a general understanding that this virus is following the pattern of various other major outbreaks, specifically the Spanish flu of 1918, which killed 50 million people, more than the First World War, where over time the virus becomes less vicious, as in it doesn't create as nearly as bad symptoms. And funny enough, it often becomes more infectious, which is what we've seen with the Omicron variant, is it became more infectious, but thank God it has become less vicious. And most scientists would say that there is an odds-on chance that that is the trajectory. Because we have this massive number of people around the world either infected or carrying the virus, the potential for mutation, which is essentially the virus's sort of survival mechanism, is to change its shape, to change its spike proteins and avoid the immune system. These mutations have and will continue to happen. The hope is that they will continue to happen in the direction that they're happening right now, which is to become less vicious, and that because we're getting to a point where between immunization and natural infection, we are at a point where many people will have some degree of immunity to the COVID virus, even if it changes shape slightly. However, there is no clear consensus that that's absolutely, it's an absolute slam dunk. It's definitely going to happen. There is still an outside chance that this virus will throw us a curved ball, and in fact might become more vicious, more infectious, and more deadly. But we pray, and as I say, the general feeling is that we are headed in the right direction. I think we're headed in the direction where this becomes, from what they call a pandemic, affecting most populations most of the time, to something we call endemic, which is sort of pulses of infection with smaller populations. And that's essentially what flu is. And funnily enough, the yearly flu that we deal with is actually the same virus that actually caused the 1918 Spanish flu. And it is a variation of that we get each year. And those of you that know the flu injection we have each year, that is out each year, is slightly different because it's dealing with different variations of that virus. And I think what people are projecting is that is what will happen with this virus. is those people, particularly at risk, should get vaccinated and have boosters. And we think what will happen is that the COVID vaccine will be incorporated into the annual flu vaccine. Just to give you a reminder, actually, the seasonal flu kills 650,000 people per year globally. So flu is not something that we take lightly. And certainly if you are at risk, if you have comorbidities, I would strongly recommend that you have your flu vaccine anyway. So this is where we are at. You'll see the first wave, second wave, January 2020, so June, sort of April to August of 20 was the first wave, and then the second wave happened over that horrible Christmas and New Year that we all remember, and then the third wave was last year, and then we thought that we were through it, and lo and behold, along comes Omicron, and we know that story. And as you'll see here, the actual percentage daily counts were much higher, but as I said, the infectivity rate, the actual severity of Omicron was a lot lower. So in fact, our death rate was much lower, even though that spike was huge. And yes, there is a projection that we will have a fifth wave, probably somewhere around July, May, June, July. And the severity of that will again depend on mask usage, on the booster vaccine. But we don't know how severe or not that might be. And as I said, we are hoping that it will follow the pattern of Omicron. So that's very much the sort of flu season that we would be looking at. Just to remind you that, as I say, yes, we are all dropping our guard, but there's still very good reasons in certain situations. And as I said, to just continue to practice some of these things. And I know I am certainly sick and tired of them, but let's quickly go through the various preventative things and just have a look and see what is relevant and what isn't. So strangely, the one thing that many people have not picked up on enough is ventilation. If you are with people at risk, you might be at risk, you have people who are infected in the household. Ventilation is your very best defense, or one of your very best defenses against COVID. So have your parties outside, open windows. If you're in a taxi or a closed vehicle, try and open windows. So avoid crowds and poorly ventilated spaces. This washing hands, I think we've all got a little bit sick of the sanitizer, and I certainly often dodge that person who is offering them to me. But it's a very, very good public health habit to get into. And funny enough, the old traditional soap and water is actually more effective than an alcohol-based solution in the long run. So I think stick with the habit. These are great public health habits. And so, a lot of the things we've got from COVID can actually lead to better health, from diarrheal diseases, flu, respiratory infections, and so on. And so, wash your hands often, don't dodge that sanitizer. And as I say, soap and water is still the best prevention. The social distancing, I know we all play lip service to it. So yes, it is still something that we should be doing. But I personally don't do it a huge amount unless I know that somebody is infected who I am sitting next to. Wearing a mask is very controversial, but I'd like to just point out a few things. Wearing a mask indoors, particularly in cases where there is somebody in the household who has COVID, and we'll talk about that later, is a very good idea. As well as wearing a mask in an aeroplane where you don't know who you're sitting next to, in other areas of closed public spaces. And this little graphic actually shows you why. So a cloth mask, this is a CDC graphic, reduces odds of infection by 56%. Surgical mask, which is the thing that many of us are wearing, the nice and light, 66%. And then those expensive ones that are actually used in ICUs, what they call the N95 or KN95 masks, lowers your odds by 83%. So yes, masks do work, but in very specific situations. I don't think there's a need to wear them outdoors. I don't think that there is a need to wear them as a matter of practice, except, as I say, in closed spaces or in spaces where you don't know if people that you are with may or may not have COVID, or if you yourself are at risk for one or other reason. So testing, there are two types of testing available. The one is the PCR, that is the gold standard. If you are positive on a PCR, then there is a very good chance, a highly good chance. If you're positive on a PCR, you are positive. If you're negative on a PCR, there's a 98% chance that you are negative. But these days we are seeing these, we call them lateral flow tests. You put that nasty stick down the back of your throat or up your nose, and you do a little reagent and put it. It looks a bit like a pregnancy test. And one stripe says you're positive. Says you're negative, and 2 says you're positive. Now, these tests, which are freely available, these tests are if they are positive, they are positive. You are positive. But if they are negative, they are only accurate in around 72% of cases. So it doesn't necessarily mean you are negative, i.e. they are accurate if they're positive, but not necessarily if you're negative. So in those cases, and you are fairly sure that you may have it, you either repeat it or you go and have a PCR. So I think it's important to just bring you up to date with what the latest is in terms of what happens if you're positive, either through a lateral flow or through a PCR. And this I find, I think I'm reiterating this. If you are positive and symptomatic, i.e. you have symptoms of COVID, you then must isolate for 7 days and use the normal prevention measures, a mask, get people to wear a mask around you. If you are positive and asymptomatic, this is really important. You have no need to isolate. You can go back to work. You don't need to be at home. Reiterate, you can be positive but have no symptoms, and you don't need to isolate. I would, obviously be careful around people, wear your mask in the office or whatever. And then in the same house, if somebody in the house is positive and you test positive, and you are symptomatic, then you isolate for 7 days. If you're in the same house of somebody who is positive and you are positive but asymptomatic, then you can leave the house. So I'm sure we might have questions about that. And then the next thing, obviously, this is still our best prevention measure. There is no treatment better than the COVID-19 vaccine. And so vaccinating is still our best bet for COVID-19. We have 2 vaccines, as you all probably know, Pfizer and the Johnson & Johnson. They have been proven again and again to be highly effective at keeping you out of hospital and getting very sick and cutting down transmission. There are side effects, usually within the first 48 hours, although a fascinating study I saw recently showed that 2/3 of people who reported reactions from COVID jabs actually had phantom reactions, i.e. they were given a placebo, i.e. they were given sterile water versus the real thing, and they had sore arms and felt a bit fluish and so on. However, vaccine reactions are real, but they subside in 48 hours almost with a bit of Panado, almost certainly. So are they worth taking? They absolutely are. Booster shots are now available to all, and the reason for a booster is that our immunity does wane from natural infection and from the vaccine. And by the way, the combination of natural infection and the vaccine is better than just one or the other. So if I've had COVID, I still should go and get the vaccine. So the booster shots are available. It's 60 days after Johnson & Johnson, and Pfizer 180 days, or that is, I think, 6 months post your Pfizer. Controversial, children and vaccines. Children and vaccines, it's not that controversial in that although many children are, not at risk of getting very sick. I was speaking to a doctor friend this morning whose 14-year-old son got COVID last year. He was a top sportsman. He rode downhill mountain bikes, and he has now developed long COVID, which I will discuss in a little while. So although he didn't get very sick, he has had long-term impact of his COVID infection, which has led to him stopping sport altogether. One thing about vaccines, they've also been shown, even if you get sick, it cuts down your risk of so-called long COVID, which I will deal with at the end of this talk. And up to 20% of people, including children, as you've just heard, get long COVID. So a vaccine, it's the Pfizer jab. One jab is now available to children aged between 12 and 17. My 2 children are vaccinated. I would certainly recommend it, because one thing I don't want them to do is A, infect others, but B, is to get long COVID. And we don't yet know the long-term implications of the actual virus itself. So let's just do a little bit of future gazing and look into the future as to what the future of vaccines may look like. And there's a lot of really exciting work. There is a new vaccine that has just been released in the UK, and I think it's being licensed soon in the US, called Novavax. It's a more traditional type of vaccine. It shows very high levels of efficacy against all different types of COVID variant. And it is based on the same technology as the hepatitis vaccine, which has been around for a long time. But the future of vaccines is, first of all, there are about 100 different vaccines in human trials and 70 vaccines that are still in lab trials. There's a huge amount of work. They will likely work against multiple flu strains. So the COVID virus is in fact a flu virus. And as I said, what is likely to happen is that the COVID vaccine will be incorporated into the flu vaccine. So you'll have one vaccination against a variety of different so-called flus, including COVID. I think there will be an improved immune response. So you may look at a situation where you don't even get it in the first place. Better storage. We won't have this, like the Pfizer vaccine needs ultra cold storage. These will be able to be stored in an ordinary fridge. And I think for some people, me included, one of the most exciting things about the future of vaccines, not just this vaccine, is that we are looking at different delivery mechanisms, including an oral spray. Now, 35% of Americans said that they would take the vaccine if it wasn't an injection. And I think I completely sympathize with them. So we're looking at tablets, we're looking at sprays. All of those may come in the very near future. So I think that there's a lot. One of the things about this COVID epidemic is that it has fast-tracked so many new technologies which will be used against other things, including cancers, including some hereditary diseases. So in fact, the legacy of this epidemic, funny enough, will not be the tragic death and destruction, which will obviously be a legacy, but will be the long-term impact on many medical therapies for chronic illnesses, asthma, diabetes, cancer, and so on, through this accelerated research that has happened. And vaccines are being developed against certain cancers, against malaria, using some of the technology that has come out of this epidemic. Then what is the future of treatment? Now, let me just say, as a dean of Tufts Medical School said, is that none of the therapies that I'm about to talk about are anywhere near as effective as the vaccine. So that is a disclaimer for what I'm about to say. But there is development, particularly around antibodies, actually developing antibodies that are grown in the lab, that actually you get given antibodies in that an antibody-based therapy. As soon as you begin to maybe feel ill or you test positive, you are going to get antibody therapies, which are already being used with some success. The problem with antibody therapies is that they are directed only at one type of variant. So, for instance, antibody therapies developed for the Delta variant don't work against the Omicron variant, and so on. There's also antiretrovirals or antivirals that are being developed. These again have promise and have been shown to work. But again, there is no therapy that is going to be widely available that is as efficacious and as I mean, every therapy has side effects. I think I want to reiterate that. If you open your Panado bottle and you look at the range of side effects, every therapy has side effects. So the side effects from any of these antivirals, these antibodies, certainly are up there with what side effects one might or might not get from the vaccine. So I want to finish off with something that perhaps has been less talked about, and it's very personal for me, and that is long COVID. I had COVID for the first time in August of 2020. I was hardly sick at all. In fact, unless I'd been tested, which I was because my daughter had COVID, I wouldn't have known. I had carried on with a full day. It was only about 6 weeks later that I started to develop what I later understood to be the first signs of long COVID. Fatigue and palpitations, heart beating out of my chest, not able to exercise, tachycardia, which is a very fast heart rate. It then subsided. Well, I was fine for 3 or 4 months, and then it came back with vengeance in around June of last year, subsided again. And since October of 2021, I have had ongoing symptoms, flu-like symptoms, very badly brought on by exercise. I spoke about that young boy who can't exercise. I haven't been able to exercise properly for the last 4 months. This is experienced by between some symptoms, and they vary. Fatigue is not a huge issue in my case, but there are sleep disturbances, sensory disturbances, sensitivity to light, these heart issues, just feeling ill, a range of different symptoms that people had. And this is being studied. It is very equivalent to what some of you may know as chronic fatigue syndrome. And if any of you know people with that, the good news is that there's a lot of research going into long COVID, and a lot of that might actually will give hope, I think, to people with chronic fatigue syndrome. But right now there is no treatment for long COVID, and we don't know enough yet. So it's a very personal thing for me when I say, please get vaccinated. Don't wait for you or your children to get infected, because the long-term impact of the virus is infinitely more concerning than the long-term effect of any therapies or vaccines that we may have. But I'd like to sort of finish on a very positive note, which is I really do believe, as I said, that the future of this year is a good one. I think our economic activity will get back to normal. I think that the recommendations around what people should do if they are test positive are very enlightened, in that, you know, unless you are sick, which you would normally, if I feel sick, I stay at home and don't try and infect others. We just, you know, get on with life as normal. So I think, you know, in terms of opening up of the economy and the various parts of our economy that have been so desperately impacted, I think that there is globally and locally very good chances that we will get back to some degree of normality. But having said that, please get vaccinated. Don't drop your guard. and encourage others to do so. So thank you, and I will stop the sharing of my screen if I can, and come back into the...
Thank you so much. We have a ton of questions loaded up, so let's see how many we can get through. I want to start with one that did come from one of the listeners that it kind of speaks, I think, a little bit into some of the controversy around sort of vaccine mandates. So when you mentioned sort of our responsibility to protect others by getting vaccinated in terms of hospital bed availability, but obviously part of the vaccine mandate, what's motivating it is that vaccines prevent transmission. But do they? And what sort of research have you seen on how effective vaccines are at preventing transmission?
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, look, that is very controversial. There's no question. But there is no, it seems to depend on which vaccine you've had, and whether you've got any other, the amount of virus that you've been exposed to. But what is certain is that it cuts down transmission by a significant percentage. Whether it is 30 or 40 or 50% depends from person to person. But does it cut down transmission, as in getting ill in the first place? The answer is absolutely yes.
Okay.
And so the vaccine mandates, I think, are, yes, controversial. I think that in certain, because of this impact on our health system, I don't think, the backup that we have in our hospitals right now for people who have not been able to access even ordinary treatment because ordinary hospital beds have been full, is been quite significant. So whether the argument will be for that going forward, I think will depend on the variants that we see.
Okay. Can I jump into that then real quick in terms of variants? So let's talk a little bit about fifth wave and mutations. So, I mean, as you said, we don't know that the next variant is going to continue to be less dangerous, although the trajectory seems that way. I mean, so fifth wave, first, I guess my first question is, on what are we basing the prediction of a fifth wave? What's that based on? And then, I mean, just seriously, how likely is it, you think, that, the danger of mutations, how likely is it that it will increase going forward? Your own personal opinion.
Well, first of all, I think the modeling up to now about how viruses operate has been almost spot on. We go through these periods where there's hardly any infections, and we think, these guys are smoking something because they tell us in 6 weeks we're going to get another spike, and sure as sure, that's what happens. So I think when they tell us that there will be another spike coming in around sort of May, June, I would say that that's right. I think that I'm an optimistic person, and I think that we are headed in the right direction. So I think that we will have an Omicron type variant, which will be probably infectious but not terribly transmissible. Not terribly virulent, i.e. very, not going to make us very sick. However, some people have got quite sick from Omicron. So it's not a blanket thing, this thing about, well, Omicron is just a little flu. Some people have got very ill from Omicron. So I think let's not kid ourselves. I think this is still a virulent and not nice virus. And we still, as I said, do not know the long-term effects. Just because you don't get very ill, as I didn't, and by the way, I had Omicron in December, and I hardly knew I had it. I have got long COVID, and that's something you just don't want. So, that's something I think people aren't talking about very much.
Okay, thanks for flagging that one, Garth. And we'll get back to that topic, I think, of long COVID in a moment. But just kind of carrying on with vaccines. So last time we spoke a little bit about, you helped us understand herd immunity. And I think what I see in all of the government stats about vaccinations, the goal is 67%, which I presume is the point at which herd immunity. Can you refresh firstly our understanding on just what that is? And I guess my main question then is actually, what happens if we don't reach that? Either because people just don't get vaccinated, will we just keep getting mutations, and everybody will have gotten it, and we'll get to 67% via infections? But kind of what's the outlook on, because sorry, I mean, just you can think while I carry on talking, but I've seen that the government has said as well that to get to that 67%, we're looking at with Pfizer like still 2 years, and that's not counting boosters and potential further boosters, which I want to talk to you about as well. So maybe just chat to us generally about that 67% target. What happens if we don't reach it? Why is it taking so long? Anything you want to say on those issues?
Yeah, I mean, you won't hear a lot of talk about herd immunity much anymore. It was talked about a lot about that initially in the epidemic, but we don't really hear it much or talk about it much anymore. The reality is that you do get to a certain point in any virus where there is some, it's circulating and enough people have been infected. And we think we're around 70% of people in this country who already have either been infected or been vaccinated or both. However, if I was infected with the Delta virus right at the beginning, just like the flu, my natural immunity doesn't necessarily prevent me getting Omicron or what comes after it. And so there is still a reason to get people vaccinated. The reason that we are, as I say, perhaps our figures are lower, is that there is already a lot of people have had this virus in one shape or another. But I come back to the example of flu. Many of us through our lives will have had the flu virus, which is a type of coronavirus, which is in the family of COVID viruses. But it doesn't prevent us necessarily getting flu each year. So yes, it will prevent you getting that sort of flu. It just doesn't prevent you necessarily. And that's where the vaccines, even if you've been naturally infected, give you a much higher level of protection than just natural immunity. So the combination of the two actually is the best.
Will we be needing boosters like forever? I think in the beginning we were like, okay, it's just these 2 shots, now it's a booster. And do you see it changing a lot from like just getting your annual flu jab, becoming a lot more important to do that, a lot more conscientizing of people towards that? Or do you think there will come a point when we won't need boosters anymore?
So I think until we get to June of this year, I'd say that all of us should have boosters, because we don't know what this next variant will look like. As I say, I think the odds are that it'll be fine. But again, the data is clear that a booster certainly increases your level of antibodies, and those do wane over time, which is why it's like having your, in the car, you go along, your tires are pumped up over time, those things, you need to go to the garage and get it pumped up again. I think we'll get a better picture in June, July as to how often we'll need it. My sense is that probably at-risk people are going to need it, i.e. anyone over 60 or comorbidities of one form or another will need the annual booster at least. But the rest of the population will go back to its choice, like your flu jab is choice. So that's where I think it's going to go, but record me and quote me, and you can't sue me.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate that opinion. So just talking about June then and fifth wave coming, I've been very excited to see the changes in some of the protocols around isolating, and I think we saw schools and social distancing requirements being changed. Just from a personal point of view, with the church situation, seating is a nightmare, Garth, with social distancing. Like the chance that one day we could do without that, do away with that would be amazing. So looking at the fifth wave and with the changes as we've learned more about this virus, do you see us going to a situation where things like social distancing perhaps are removed? You've explained masks, I think, quite well, and washing of hands and vaccines. Maybe speaking to social distancing a little bit, and then just at the same time, do you think the whole lockdown scenario, I don't really want to go back into was it necessary, but is there any chance that we would be on phase level 1, level 2, level 3 again? What are your thoughts?
So there's always a chance. Do I think that the chance is a good one? I think absolutely not. I think it's highly, highly, highly unlikely. You know, we're in a very different place now. I mean, even if we do get a slightly more virulent virus, you know, the level of vaccination amongst people at risk, the level of natural immunity has increased. So no, I think that you'll see as well, social distancing will drop down. I think that and again, this is speculation, but you know, the certificate of vaccination on your phone or whatever you might have a thing where in the church you'll say if you've been vaccinated you don't need to distance, but I don't know actually. But I think the trajectory is to get back to so-called normal life. But I do really want to reiterate that doesn't mean to say that one should not get vaccinated or take the basic precautions. So I think particularly people who feel they may be at risk or feel a bit fluish, they should almost distance themselves. So, you know, in the same way, if I test positive but I can go back to work, I will be more, you know, careful about distancing myself. And that's, I think, what we hope people will do who are asymptomatic but have found out that they're positive. But I think that the trajectory is a good one in terms of gatherings such as church.
Thanks, Garth. Changing tack slightly, you spoke about treatments for it. Any word on ivermectin? It seems to have gone quiet on that front too these days.
Again, a very emotive topic, and you know, I have a science background, so I look at things. I will ask myself first of all, who is saying whatever they're saying? So who is the messenger? And check the credentials of the messenger. The second thing is does the majority of global scientific evidence and leaders support whoever is saying whatever they're saying, as in the studies? On that level, ivermectin does not pass that test for efficacy. You know, the largest study I've seen is clearly showing that there is no added benefit to ivermectin. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence, but again, I would query what the trajectory would have been without ivermectin. So ivermectin, chloroquine, these are not two treatment regimens that have the vast majority of scientific thought behind them. And to be honest, you know, this is a global pandemic. So this is not a bunch of scientists who've all on speed dial to each other, dreaming up how we're going to get rid of ivermectin, or, you know, this is big pharma trying to crush a treatment that doesn't make them money. You know, there just isn't the capacity for all scientists everywhere who have any credibility to do that. And so evidence around ivermectin and chloroquine is absolutely not there as a treatment modality for COVID.
Thanks, Garth. Maybe just since we're on that subject, I want to spend too much time on this. Got a couple more questions for you, but just since we're in the controversial space here, just, you know, thinking, you mentioned that, you know, just how clear it is that this COVID is a derivative of the flu virus and is becoming more and more like it going along. Would that kind of put paid to the, I think, some ongoing sort of conspiracy theories around it being developed in a lab, you know, if it really is just another flu virus and it's very similar to, you know, other outbreaks of flu-like viruses. So maybe just, you know, some thoughts on that one. And if you have any other thoughts around some of the conspiracy theories going around. But also just, you know, on that subject, you know, I think I saw in the news just the anti-vax sort of march in Australia, and we had the high-profile case, the whole Novak Djokovic, you know, in Australia, that, you know, without getting into the detail of that, just how you would approach somebody who's still seriously skeptical about the vaccine. I mean, you've told us about the science behind it, but I'm speaking more like a personal approach. Like, what do you do? Someone in your family, you know, family member, I mean, your family, all doctors. And so just comment on that and the personal approach.
Yeah, so just to remind me, your first question was...
have we put paid to the developed in a lab
So
conspiracy?
yes, sorry, I went down the conspiracy rabbit hole quickly. No, I mean, I think we don't know, to be honest. And yes, it is possible to alter a virus in a lab. And we don't know because I don't think, there's been sufficient access to the ground zero for this, which was in China. Most people would say that this probably came from bats. There's a long history of jumping from one species from another, and certainly this coronavirus is no different. At this point of the epidemic, I think it doesn't really matter because it's here. I think if there were any sort of fingers to point at the Chinese, was, from what I can understand, is that in fact they knew that this was a virulent virus much earlier than was publicly let go. And so we would potentially have been 2 or 3 months ahead of this epidemic before they actually released data or information about this. So that, I think, is true, and the rest is just theory. I don't think it came from a lab. I think there's the long history of these viruses coming from an animal host to humans, and funny enough, we're seeing them go back into animals as well, COVID infecting animals. So yeah, in terms of how ultimately, unfortunately, this is very much it's like a Republican and a Democrat having a debate around, particularly two Christians having a debate around politics in the States. This is an emotive issue, and ultimately we are emotive creatures. We make decisions not based on fact but on emotion, and so to be honest, those that are virulently anti-vax, I can give you all the theory and the background. I think the only thing that I really, as a Christian, feel very strongly about is that I am not getting vaccinated for myself. Yes, I'd love to have been vaccinated so I didn't get long COVID. I can tell you that. Even though I didn't get sick, I have got long COVID. But I am getting vaccinated, and I think this seems to get lost in discourse because the evidence is so compelling that not getting vaccinated has filled up hospital and ICU beds, and the impact on our medical systems around the world has been severe. And those 100 people in Tygerberg Hospital who could have been saved by head and neck surgery are now dead as a result of people's decision not to get vaccinated. So that for me is the most compelling reason that I can give, which is an emotive one too. If you know somebody who did not have hospital treatment, but facts don't work, I'm afraid. It's not a fact-based argument.
Okay, Garth, thank you. I found that helpful. Thanks for sharing that. Last question, Garth. Just want to track back to, I suppose, your personal story, just around long COVID. And I mean, you're right. We really haven't seen much about that. You've said that there's a lot of research going on about it. Are there any results from that? I suppose mostly in line with like treating it or managing long COVID. I really do think we have people listening who have long COVID, and it'd be helpful if any of the research you come across, if there's something that will be helpful to them for you to share.
Yeah, look, first of all, there is no correlation between the severity of your infection and your potential to develop long COVID. So I had an almost asymptomatic infection. Secondly, so I think that's an important thing to remember for people who say, well, look, I'm young. Thankfully, up to this point, I have been fit and I don't have any comorbidities. So I think that's one point. In terms of treatments, there are a range of sort of trial treatments. I'm on one of them at the moment. There's a theory that has been developed by a professor of physiology at Stellenbosch University that part of what is happening with COVID is it's creating microclots, which is why, for instance, the only symptom I had actually was something called COVID toe, which is your toe looks like you've stubbed it. It sort of goes red and it's sore. And that's because you're getting little clots in your tiny veins are blocking up and becoming red and sore. And so for the last 3 weeks have been on some quite hectic anti-clotting agents. So that's the one thing, and I'm going to see how that works. I'm also working with a physiotherapist right now who's taking me through a whole regimen of slowly getting back into exercise, to using rest. I think that acknowledging the fact that often in medicine we look at things, you either treat it with a drug or you don't. There's a lot of lifestyle things in terms of rest, in terms of sleep habits, in terms of how to get back to exercise post-COVID. So unfortunately have a very personal interest in this. And so I'm reading up, and I will see whether, this, which is the first thing that I've come across in terms of treatment, has any real outcome.
And do you think it's something that, I mean, we're all hoping, and God just praying for you and others, but is it something that we expect long COVID will, like short COVID, that you will recover from, or are we really looking at something that could be sort of lifelong?
And we just don't know. I think many people are recovering from long COVID. Some people are not. So it seems to be mirroring what we would know as chronic fatigue syndrome. There you're looking at a sort of, depends on which literature, anywhere from 5% to 30% recovery. Otherwise, it's a lifelong thing. I pray God it's not. But that's why, when this is not a little flu, this virus, and the outcomes of this virus is not just whether I survived my sore throat and runny nose. It's the ongoing impact on a range. The other big thing about long COVID that I don't have, fortunately, is brain fog. Sort of just feeling, just muggy head, can't think properly, which is a typical chronic fatigue syndrome symptom as well. And I don't have that. Well, it may have seemed like I have that from this talk, but I can assure you I don't.
No, it didn't seem like that, Garth. I suppose I've got just 1 minute left, maybe, and just a quick question that just came in from the floor. Any thoughts on the Pfizer versus J&J? Should people be tending towards one or the other? Are there other, you mentioned the Novavax and stuff in the States, but anything we need to concern ourselves about in terms of the actual manufacturer of the drug, or just take what we can get?
No, I think looking in urban areas, most people are getting Pfizer, and there's certainly, a couple of billion people who've had the Pfizer, and so, and the reason we're getting Pfizer in urban areas is because of the cold chain. J&J is what health professionals, including myself, have had, and that tends to be more available in rural areas. But I would say, the evidence on both is fairly good, and is very good. You should take what you can get. And I think the one thing that I must, commend our regulatory authorities is there's, been applications from some Chinese vaccines, some Russian vaccines, which have been turned down because of it has not had enough peer-reviewed scientific evidence around the validity of those clinical trials, or the side effect profiles, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, it's something that we can be proud of, is that our science in this area and our authorities in this area are still world-class, and I think we can trust them.
Well, that's a positive note to end on, Garth. I think it is something we, in South Africa, with the whole Omicron, I was in the States at the time, actually visiting family when that broke, and was concerned about getting home. And so South Africa was in the world news. And so we are proud of what our medical community here has done. And so thank you, Garth. Thank you so much just for your time tonight. And please be sure that we really are thinking of you and praying for you, and looking forward to seeing what comes out of the long COVID research. But time has been really worthwhile to us. I think our last webinar with you broke all the records for all of our webinars in terms of views. And so we really appreciate the time that you're giving us, Garth. So thank you to you. Thank you to everybody out there who's watched this webinar tonight. If you find it helpful, please go ahead and just share it with everybody that you know. I'm sure it'll be helpful to so many people as we look forward to kind of exiting the serious side of this pandemic and returning to some kind of a more normal life. But don't let your guards down just yet. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening. See you all next time.